Standing outside the grand ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel, I smoothed down my simple, plum-tailored suit. Holding a small box containing a vintage watch I had spent months hunting down as a celebration gift for my husband, Mark Sterling. Inside, the muffled sounds of laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and classical music filled the air. Tonight was supposed to be the biggest night of Mark's career, the celebration of his promotion to Executive Vice President at Sterling Global Logistics. But as I stepped toward the polished brass doors, two towering security guards stepped in front of me, their faces cold and unyielding. The head guard glanced down at a glossy tablet, typed in my name, and then looked back up at me with zero emotion. He clearly stated, "Sorry, ma'am, you are not on the guest list, and Mr. Sterling specifically instructed us that no uninvited visitors are permitted inside tonight." I stood there in shock, feeling the sting of public embarrassment as several well-dressed guests walked past me into the ballroom. I asked him to double-check, thinking it was a mistake, but he repeated Mark's explicit orders. Right then, I noticed Mark standing near the bar, inside, through the glass doors, holding a glass of scotch, laughing alongside a young woman in an expensive sequined gown who was leaning closely into his arm. Mark glanced toward the entrance, caught my eyes for a split second, and deliberately turned his back on me, acting as if I were a total stranger. Did not cause a scene. I did not scream, throw a fit, or cry. I quietly walked back to my car, pulled out my phone, opened my private messaging app, and sent a single text to my family's chief financial attorney. Freeze all Sterling family trust funds. Cancel all executive credit cards associated with the estate. And initiate immediate audit protocols. Within 5 minutes, the entire party came to a sudden, screeching halt. To understand why a single text message had the power to dismantle my husband's life in minutes, you have to understand the foundation of our marriage. Mark and I had been married for 6 years. When I first met Mark, he was an ambitious, low-level manager working at Sterling Global Logistics. What Mark never realized, or rather what he chose to ignore over the years, was that Sterling Global was not just a company he worked for. It was a firm created and funded entirely by my family's venture capital trust, the Sterling Heritage Group. When Mark and I got married, my father and I made a quiet agreement. We wanted Mark to feel capable and accomplished on his own merit. We decided not to parade my true net worth or my family's ownership of the company in front of him or his arrogant relatives. I lived modestly, wore sensible clothes, drove an older sedan, and let Mark believe that he was the primary provider and rising star of the household. Over time, however, the taste of corporate success began to corrupt Mark completely. He grew distant, arrogant, and increasingly dismissive of me. His mother and sister, who treated me like a penniless burden, constantly reminded me at family dinners that Mark was moving up in the world, while I was just an ordinary woman holding him back. Mark never defended me. In fact, he encouraged their behavior. In the months leading up to his promotion, Mark stopped coming home for dinner, claiming he was working late hours on critical deals. I noticed new charges on our shared accounts for designer perfume and women's jewelry that never made their way to me. When I asked him about it, he brushed me off, saying I was being paranoid and that I did not understand high-level business networking. The final straw came when he casually forgot to mention the location and time of his EVP promotion party, claiming it was a strictly private event for top executives and elite investors. I had decided to surprise him anyway, thinking that, despite our distance, celebrating his hard work was the right thing to do. That brings us back to the doors of the Grand Regency. Standing outside, watching Mark whisper into the ear of his young personal assistant, while security turned me away on his direct orders, the veil was completely lifted. I realized that my modesty had been mistaken for weakness. Mark believed I was powerless, dependent, and easily disposable now that he had reached the top. He had no idea that every dollar funding his high-profile promotion party, every line of credit powering his company, Perks, and even the salary attached to his new position was underwritten by my family's estate. Walking to my luxury SUV, parked 2 blocks away, I sat in the driver's seat and composed the message to Arthur, our family's lead corporate counsel and trustee. Arthur had been managing my family's wealth for over 2 decades and had strictly warned me years ago to protect my assets with a bulletproof prenuptial agreement. When Arthur received my text to freeze all Sterling family trust funds and freeze all corporate credits, he executed the command instantly. 5 minutes after I drove away from the hotel, the immediate financial shockwave hit the venue. Inside the ballroom, Mark was mid-toast, raising his glass to the board members and key shareholders. He pulled out his black executive corporate card to settle the preliminary 5-figure event bill required by the hotel management before opening the main dinner service. The card was declined. Thinking it was a temporary glitch, Mark handed over his secondary high-limit card. Declined again. Within moments, the head hotel manager personally approached Mark in front of his peers, informing him that all personal and corporate cards linked to the Sterling estate had been frozen for suspected fraud and non-authorization. Panic began to spread across Mark's face as the venue staff immediately paused catering service and turned off the main event lighting, plunging the room into low, ambient light. Before Mark could comprehend what was happening, his phone rang. It was the CEO of Sterling Global Logistics who was attending the party. The CEO had just received an urgent notification from the board of directors informing him that the primary capital group backing the firm had initiated an emergency audit and withdrawn all liquidity guarantees due to executive misconduct. Mark's promotion was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full forensic investigation into his unauthorized personal expenses charged to corporate accounts. Mark stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom as his colleagues began whispering and stepping away from him. The young woman who had been clinging to his arm quietly slipped into the crowd and exited the building. An hour later, Mark rushed home, barging through the front door with a pale face and frantic eyes. He found me sitting calmly in the living room with Arthur, my lawyer, and 2 professional movers, packing up my personal belongings. Mark began shouting, begging for an explanation, asking why I had ruined the best night of his life, and claiming there was a massive misunderstanding at the venue. I simply picked up a folder from the table and handed it to him. Inside were receipts detailing his lavish expenditures on his assistant. photographs of their private weekend trips, billed to company funds, and the legal documentation proving that I held full authority over the entire Sterling Investment Group. As Mark read through the documents, his face drained of all color. He realized in an instant that the life of luxury and power he thought he had built was completely built on my generosity. Mark fell to his knees, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, promising that he would cut ties with his assistant and devote his life to making things right. But the time for second chances had passed long ago. I looked down at him with quiet finality, gathered my coat, and walked out the door without uttering a single harsh word. Within 3 months, the divorce was finalized under the ironclad terms of our prenuptial agreement, leaving Mark with nothing but his personal debts and a revoked executive status. He was terminated from Sterling Global Logistics following the audit and was forced to sell his luxury vehicle to cover his legal fees. Today, I continue to run my family's portfolio with absolute clarity, knowing that true power never needs to shout or seek approval, and that respect is something you should never have to beg for in your own life.